I have a close friend who's a pretty successful software engineer and he loves AI. I see him reading books on neural networks, articles on DeepMind and the like. I can't pretend to understand his field, but he raises an interesting question. Is it possible that at some point in the future, machines will be able to produce music indistinguishable from that of a human? What my friend argues is, if music is ultimately a set of patterns, then, hypothetically, a machine could be fed hundreds or thousands of these patterns and learn from it. It could practice writing its own music, iterate, and gradually learn to produce something indistinguishable from a human's creation. Or maybe even better than a human's creation. Of course, my knee-jerk reaction is to say no, that's impossible, it would never work. A machine could never adequately recreate expressive, emotionally charged music. But that's not really an argument. If a machine can learn from thousands of great works of music, if it could figure out patterns and begin to churn out its own pieces, perhaps it could reach a point where it starts putting out pieces of strong, expressive quality, even if it doesn't share the human experience itself. So, this problem bears thinking about on a deeper level. Of course, one of the core assumptions of this is that music can be boiled down to a set of patterns, albeit a complex one. We can see these patterns at a simpler level in some music, certainly. For example, you might have songs with an extremely repetitious beat, something like this, looped for 3 minutes straight. It's feasible that a computer would learn from repetitive beat patterns and be able to reproduce a pop-worthy beat. Or what about a chord sequence? You might have heard of the 4-chord song. There are many different versions of this, but it exposes that hundreds of pop songs use exactly the same 4 chords in similar or identical sequences. So again, there are clear patterns emerging. If our AI was fed hundreds of melodies, it might then easily be able to synthesize a beat, a chord sequence, and a melody, at least to a cliched, tired, done-before song. This is perfectly within the realms of the imagination. In fact, there's already software doing that kind of thing. You might remember Microsoft's Songsmith. That's essentially what it did. It gave you a generic beat and a bad but functional chord sequence over your melody.
I'm making songs with Songsmith, Dad, because it's...
Though that wasn't AI, that was just a piece of software. AI, we hope, will be capable of more complex and perhaps more human-sounding music. So again, the idea is that you feed a computer lots of examples of the thing it needs to learn. That computer then essentially teaches itself by collecting this data and then finding patterns and structures which are similar within that data. They can then use these patterns to create something new. So hypothetically, we could train a machine to sound like J.S. Bach, one of the great classical composers, feed it some rules, say years 1, 2, and 3 of Lovelock's Harmony, and feed it a few hundred pieces of Bach so that it can teach itself Bach's style. In fact, this is essentially what Google did in one of their Doodle projects to celebrate a Bach anniversary. You could feed it a melody, and it would harmonize it in the style of Bach. It does alright with simpler melodies. But struggles a bit with even slightly complex melodies. Doesn't really sound human, and it's very far from Bach. Maybe this task is more complex than it first seemed. And that's only Bach Chorales, a relatively rule-bound, clear-cut form, which many music students in England are expected to be able to write by ages 17 to 18. It seems like the computer understands Bach's harmony on a note-by-note basis, but it hasn't developed a sense of overarching flow, a sense of logical direction over a 2-bar phrase. And I imagine programming a machine to understand that overarching musical logic is a complex task. And what about something more advanced than Bach? Can a computer sound like Chopin? Listen to this example. It's like lots of different imitations of Chopin, but again, there's nothing close to a sense of flow, a sense of internal logic, which leads us from one bar to the next in a satisfying and coherent way. You compare that with the real thing, and it's nothing close. But Chopin's music is highly complex. I can forgive AI for not being there yet, this is relatively early days. So Bach and Chopin are a bit more complicated than they first seemed, but maybe AI will get there in the future, more on that later. But what about pop music, or genres which, at least on the surface, are a bit simpler than Bach and Chopin? Well, I discovered that Amazon Web Services have recently released a new toy, AWS DeepComposer. As soon as I heard about this, I rushed to check it out. You simply feed it some music, let's say Ode to Joy, and its AI spews out this kind of thing. Random, bizarre drum fills, these funny high notes at the end.
Not too shabby.
I mean, it's just bizarre. Who thought this was ready for a public release? It also seems like it hasn't really learnt how to end a song yet.
Me and my jar will both be gone.
Then again, from the computer science perspective, at least it's produced something. You could argue that it's amazing for it to be able to produce anything at all, considering how complex a task this is. But to us musicians, it sounds like a bad joke.
Not too shabby.
A much better example would be AIVA, the new AI composer, which has been fed around 30,000 scores. Through this, it can write music for you under certain parameters. You can choose whether you want it to be major or minor, what kind of group you want to play it, and how long you want it to be. No indication of tempo, key, style, apart from the incredibly broad parameter of classical. From the TED Talk, you'd think that this was an extraordinarily real composer. When I first heard its examples, I thought, oh crap, we're going to be out of a job. But then you watch the actual video of it being used, and to be honest, it's a little bit disappointing. It seems like the examples used in the TED Talk have almost certainly had a bit of human help. Have a listen to the kind of music it typically produces. It really lacks soul and diversity, and I think this is a significant problem. I've said that AI will collect data, find patterns, and find structures which are similar within that data, and they'll then use these patterns to create something new. These aren't my words, they're the words of Google software engineers. The problem is, when your goal is to find and produce patterns similar across thousands of different tracks, you might come up with something as bland and lifeless as this. Some average, common pattern, which is technically functional, but lacks any melodic interest at all, precisely because it's not different enough. Because many of the songs which stick out the most to us are those which break pattern sequences, those which don't conform to the bland, most obvious patterns, but which do something different. Take the wild, lasting success of a band like Queen. Their songs aren't successful because they are the sum average of thousands of great songs. Their songs are successful because they are unique, full of character, and they seem to have soul. Their songs break away from common patterns rather than follow them. More broadly, we could read the whole history of Western music as being a sequence of breaking patterns, as one generation of composers breaks away and defines themselves as being different from the previous generation. How can a computer predict what the next trend will be? Trends of music are not statistically predictable in the way that stock market trends or even sports trends might be. Around 2009, for example, dubstep suddenly blew up, became hugely popular, and a few years later, it disappeared from the mainstream almost as fast as it appeared. And in contemporary music, the trend is often about sounds, creating a fresh sound, a fresh style. We can give a computer certain parameters like harmony, rhythm, melody, but can we teach it to develop a taste for sound and all the infinite subtleties of sound? Sound, which is an inherent part of music. This is a much more complex task and a complex philosophical problem. What about the aesthetic embodied in Billie Eilish's music, to take one current style? If you'd fed a computer the sum average of past songs from the 1960s to 2015, how on earth would it create a new, fresh sound like this one, when all its results are based on the past? On top of all this, there's the problem of having soul. Can a computer create music with soul? Of course, as I suggested earlier, a computer doesn't necessarily need to understand human emotion or expression. It only needs to successfully mimic it. But this might be more complicated than it seems. Let's take the example of literature first. Many of you have probably seen that hilarious example of the fake Harry Potter story written by AI. They fed it all 7 Harry Potter books and asked it to come up with its own. Here is an excerpt. He saw Harry and immediately began to eat Hermione's family. Ron's Ron shirt was just as bad as Ron himself. If you two can't clump happily, I'm going to get aggressive, confessed the reasonable Hermione. What about Ron magic? Offered Ron. To Harry, Ron was a loud, slow, and soft bird. Harry did not like to think about birds. Death Eaters are on top of the castle, Ron bleated, quivering. Ron was going to be spiders. He just was. So, what's interesting about this is that all these sentences are pretty much syntactically correct. It reads like a hilariously absurdist story, and yet, in terms of human experience, it just doesn't make sense. Another sentence is, they almost legged it, but witches are not climbing. It's kind of like Noam Chomsky's famous sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Syntactically, that's a perfect sentence, and yet none of it makes sense. It can't be both colorless and green. Ideas can't sleep. Furiously and sleep don't go together, and so on. And I think this raises an interesting point about AI. On the one hand, it's amazing that it's reached a point where it can spew out coherent sentences, and it actually presents a fairly cohesive, though ridiculous narrative. That's kind of incredible. And yet, when the machine doesn't know what these words mean, let alone what they mean in context, it'll come out with sentences like, "Not so handsome now," said Harry as he dipped Hermione in hot sauce. But we can go a step further than that. How can a machine create something which resonates with the human experience when a machine doesn't know the human experience? It only knows to follow and mimic patterns. Maybe AI will reach the point where it can tell coherent short stories, which actually make sense without the nonsense. But some of the best literature is that which can powerfully capture human experience. One poetic tool for this is metaphor, the device which creates an imaginary connection between two unlike things. Take "My thoughts are stars I cannot fathom into constellations," or "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity," or "It is the east and Juliet is the sun." No, Juliet is not literally the sun, and this metaphor is very different from the nonsense of the machine saying Ron was a loud, slow, and soft bird. These metaphors work because they are written based on rich human experience, because there are these complex and beautiful associations which combine and map onto each other. And there's also a subtle difference between saying Juliet is like the sun, a simile, and Juliet is the sun, a metaphor which poetically welds together ideas in beautiful combination. It couldn't just be any two words, though. We know through human experience that thoughts and stars work especially well together, or Juliet and sun, or the island of ignorance in the black seas of infinity. We know these work because we are alive and we experience. And these metaphors resonate with us because they are insightful. They reveal something to us about life, about meaning. How could a machine possibly be expected to come up with a new, powerful metaphor when it shares none of this experience of what it is to be alive and to perceive the world? Unless, of course, AI was to brute force writing a million metaphors, the old 1,000 monkeys on 1,000 typewriters.
It was the best of times, it was the blurst of times.
In which case, any potent metaphor would simply be coincidence and not such a significant achievement. But you might say music is simpler than literature. It can be reduced to a series of patterns. And this is where I disagree. While maybe the computer could mimic the patterns of very simple songs, the best music, too, has a strong resonance with human experience and with the human soul. James May once did a BBC documentary on machines where he showed this piece. A machine had been fed a bunch of Beethoven and it came up with this. I think it's very good, very realistic, coherent. There are things of moderate interest in that piece. Good job, computer, if there were no human hands involved to clean things up a bit. And yet, Mr. May says,
then the software emulates those patterns. It's able to produce a musical score, but is that really creative? There were no new ideas in there, no hint of emotion, and that's important.
What is musical emotion? This is a very challenging and necessarily subjective question. You almost want to avoid bringing it up with a software engineer because there's a very real danger that it can't be codified, that it's not just about patterns which recur across music, but it truly is something more ineffable than that. I've tried to explain this in a previous video on musical expression and how it resonates with our own human empathies and expressions. And yet, my argument for musical expression is only one of many. And the moments of music that affect me the most might do nothing for you, and vice versa. There is a subjectivity and also an ineffability about this problem, which has led to huge amounts of musical philosophy books being written on exactly this problem. I know that this moment of music emotionally affects me because somehow it connects with my empathies. I feel its journey, and crucially, it resonates with my human experience. And so, in the same way that we need human experience to create resonant metaphors, we need human experience to create and share truly expressive music. Lastly, there's the moral issue. I noticed underneath an AIVA video, someone had commented, "As composers, we don't compose music for others so much as for the joy of creating. All art jobs are therefore sacred, and I wish scientists would deliberately stop developing AI for art. Every other job, replace it away, but not art. Because people don't live that much for being cab drivers and such, but people live for art. And taking that away, the scientists would take not just money from composers or artists, but their purposes in life." I think that's very well said. And yet, based on what I've been exploring all of this video, I think we're thankfully, hopefully, a very, very long way away from that. While AI might be able to replicate, mimic, predict, and learn, it doesn't share or even understand our essential human experience, which flows through the most resonant works of art. This video is sponsored by Encoder. It's an incredible library of sheet music straight to your tablet, phone, or laptop. We're talking tens of thousands of pieces from over 100 publishers. I love how intuitive the user interface is too. They curate playlists for different themes, from Renaissance meditation to seeing sound to Nordic. So it's a really cool way to discover new music and explore an absolutely massive library. They're offering free trials, so definitely check it out at encoder.com. That's NKODA.com. If you want to support my channel's work or simply buy me a coffee to say thank you, you can visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/InsideTheScore. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.